So, like Ulf already mentioned, I will explain something about Hoofprint, which is a calculation tool that we developed for the EEF. And with that tool, you can calculate the carbon footprint. But before I go into that, I'll first introduce myself and tell a bit what I do. And then, we move on from there. So my name is Huisman, and so together with my colleagues Theun Vellinga and Hassan Pishgar, I've developed Hoofprint. We all work at Wageningen University Research, and which is part of Wageningen University Research. We all work on research in sustainability in agriculture, and especially on animal production systems. And myself, I have a background in equine science and also a master's in animal science. So what I'll tell you a bit about today is, before we dive into Hoofprint, I'll first tell a little bit, just to touch upon sustainability. What is it? What do we understand about it? And then what does it mean in, or what is known about it in equestrianism? Then before we dive into the tool, I'll tell you a bit about greenhouse gas emissions, which ones play a role. Then I'll touch upon the development of Hoofprint, and then we'll have a quick look at it, and I'll show you some results. And at the end, there is time for some questions, of course. So sustainability is quite a broad topic, I reckon. It has a lot of different dimensions. And when we talk about it, we often talk about these three different P's, so people, planet, and profit. And today we focus on the P of planet, and that has to do with climate. Then if you look at what it means for equestrianism, or what is done, what we do see is that there is increasing interest, like Ulf, I think, already mentioned in his introduction, and that's shown from the sector by different initiatives that are taken either by the sector or also publications on from organizations that were consulted by the sector. And there's a there's a lot of different range and different topics. So it might cover animal welfare or biodiversity. And when we look into the scientific literature, that's also a lot of topics are focused on animal welfare. And also when you look at the environment, it's often focused on more on the local impact. So for example, ammonia emissions from stable bedding, or nitrogen leaching, and those are all more local. But there's actually not much known about greenhouse gas emissions. And there's nothing being reported on it quite yet. So that's what I'm going to tell you a bit more about, and what we attempted with Hoofprint. So first, the greenhouse gas emissions that play a role in agriculture are methane, nitrous oxide, and carbon dioxide. Methane often comes from enteric fermentation and manure management. Nitrous oxide also comes from manure management and feed production. And then carbon dioxide from fossil fuel burning or deforestation, in some cases in feed production. And all these emissions are converted to CO2 equivalents. And then you can speak of a carbon footprint, which is an emission intensity per unit. So you can express the carbon footprint per product or per surface. So the development of Hoofprint. So the goal was to create insight into the greenhouse gas emissions from equines. And with Hoofprint, we especially focused on the sport horse. And it was focused on husbandry and all related activities. And we wanted to identify emission hotspots. We wanted to develop a standard tool and methodology for the equine carbon footprint calculations. So what we've done, and what we usually use, is the life cycle assessment approach. This is also very commonly used for production animals. There's a lot of work done, for example, for dairy cows. There's a lot of LCA studies. And what you do with an LCA, you usually go through several different steps, and you have to sort of define a system. So what is the system you're actually going to look at? So is it stable or wider? So you have to sort of set your boundaries. I'll explain a bit about that, more about that in a minute. And of course you need data. So we collected data from various different stables, and we also used for LCA, there are also a lot of different guidelines, and we also used them. So to first start, before we dive into what we actually define as a system, is that we first created a storyline. So if you look at equine sector, it's a lot different from the production sectors that we usually study. So the equine sector is a lot more diverse and consists of a lot of different elements. So what we've done is we came up with this framework. So if you look at a sport horse, like it obviously doesn't fall out of the sky all of a sudden. So it has a whole history. So first, you have reproduction. So there's a foal, and that needs to be raised. So we said, like, okay, so you first have your reproduction, and then after 1 or 2 years, the animal moves to a different state. Well, sometimes a different stable, sometimes the same, but goes into the rearing process. And then it moves from training into training. And all these different stages that we define, they have certain inputs, and they all come with emissions. So if we then look at what we define as the system boundary, is that, so what you see in the middle is the training stable, where you see different aspects so that play a role, so the diet, manure management, and what you see on the upper down at the left at the bottom is that we saw the reproduction and racing as an input for the training stable. So we first calculated the reproduction and raising emissions, because otherwise you don't have the full emission. You need to sort of take the history into account in order to calculate the full emissions from a sport horse. And these are always expressed with a functional unit. So what we used 1 year activity in sports, which in production animals it's usually used. Well, that's more a product. So then they use, for example, kilogram product or kilogram meat or milk. And it further shows the inputs and then outputs. So then a quick view of what the tool actually looks like. So please don't focus on all the text. It's way too much to read. But it's all about just to give you a bit of a look what it looks like. So so it's an Excel-based tool, and you see the red circle. You see there's a first page, then you have an input page, a result page, and a help page, which for the help page, it's like the real, like urgent questions. And if you want to dive more into what you actually need done or want to create better understanding, we also created a manual to go with Hoofprint. So yeah, you can always go back and refer to the manual. Then what the model actually consists of. So as a user, what you have to do is you have to fill in the input page, and you have to fill in information on the animal, so the horse, the stable, training, and diet. So training is, for example, the intensity of training. We defined different intensities, and we actually used the Dutch CVB method for that. And you have to fill in, for example, information on diet. So what does the ration consist of? And give a bit of a percentage on how much of a share that is from the diet. Then in order to calculate all the emissions, I just quickly touch upon this. I won't explain this in detail. So then there's a lot of different modules behind this. So there's a whole herd module. So because you need a certain herd to create a sport horse. And then there's all different modules. There's a feed database. There's a page that calculates energy requirements, and we also, of course, need to use emission factors to calculate emissions. For example, they've come from the IPCC, and this information goes into an emission calculation page that then calculates the emissions. But as a user, you don't need to actually do anything with the green part. You just need to fill an input page. So then to touch up a little bit on results, what do we actually find out? So if you look at a 1-year-old horse, the main emissions come from feed. So that's almost 60% of a share. and that's followed by manure management and enteric fermentation. If you then look to an older horse that actually goes into competition, you see that a lot of the share is transport. However, important to note in this example is that we probably took quite a lot an extreme of transport. So this includes road travel and also flight, inter and intracontinental. So yeah, we kind of took that to maybe a little bit of extreme. But you see that transport then has a really large share. It doesn't mean that feed or enteric fermentation or manure management became less. It's just that the emissions from transport are huge. Then to zoom in a little bit more detail, so for example, if you see here, see that from the year, we started a year, 2 years old, is that you see that the emissions are actually not that high, quite high. However, like these the emissions are basically driven by feed, so the diet, and also by growth. So in the first few years, the animal's still growing, and it gets more and more feed, and then up until the age of like 6, 7, we sort of assumed that the animal would get the same diet. However, with the tool, you can also play, and that's where you can sort of see where you can make changes. So, for example, if you look at diet, you can play a little bit with that. So you can change ingredients, for example. So what I did here is that I changed the, I think in diet 1, there was a muesli included, and in diet 2, there was a concentrate included. So that's the only change I made. Otherwise, the diet was the same. And then you can see, okay, how much of a difference is there? And you see for a grown-up adult horse, you see that there's a difference of 11% on the emissions. So yeah, that was, I think, quite a fly through on what we did. So to sum up, Hoofprint can calculate greenhouse gas emission from equines, and with that you can identify the emission hotspots. And I think one of the take-home messages is that it is important to know what the impact is before you can actually do something about it. So otherwise you don't really know what you're changing or making improvements to. And I'd like to thank, of course, the EF and also the Swedish Federation that was a big support in helping with creating a storyline and also with data collection. Thank you. I think it's already time for questions. So
you have one in the Q&A, Iris, which was asking specifically about feed types. Are you tracing carbon footprint from the seed, origin, growth, packaging, transport? How exactly is feed being considered when you include that in the calculation?
Yeah, so we used, for the feed, we may use the Hoofprint, which is a model that actually does look at all those things. So it's actually a database that actually, takes the whole like feed production into account. See the difference in concentrate was mostly driven by the production process. Yeah, I think probably is, yeah.
Yeah, I can add to that. Indeed, that's related to the footprint of the concentrate compared to the muesli.
Yeah.
As you also have seen, is that the production of feed responsible for about 60% of the footprint of an animal without traveling. So indeed, it matters the selection of the feed materials.
But can you repeat that again, Theun? You said that if you take away the transportation, then 60% is related to the feed. Was that right?
Yeah, that's so just to have the animal somewhere in a stable, not traveling, not doing, well, training, of course, but then the production of the feed is responsible for 60% of the total emissions to keep this horse alive. And the other 40% is coming from enteric fermentation and manure.
Yeah, and to give a bit of a range, so if you look at an animal that's not being transported, the carbon footprint is an average of around 5,000 kilograms CO2 equivalents. And then if you compare it to an animal that is traveling as much as we've shown in the slide, that's 35,000. So that is quite a difference and quite an impact from transport. Is there a similar database for various kinds of bedding? We actually didn't take bedding into this account, to be honest. It is a first model attempt, and we also make use of different standards and models that are already out there for other animal species, and then usually bedding is not included. So that's one of the improvements that we hope to make in the future.
One of the things we have straw in the feed database because it's also a feed, and well, the footprint doesn't change when you use it as bedding. So it's relatively easy to include bedding in the next version.
Mm-hmm.
But to continue that route, and to include that, is the same kind of database, so you can get that information easily as it is from the seed point of view?
Sorry, could you repeat that, Olof?
Is there a database that you can use for bedding as well?
Not a general bedding database, but there is a database where all kinds of feed materials are incorporated. And well, things like sawdust are not in that database because it's not considered as a feed. But you know, it's relatively easy to add a few lines to the database and also add this bedding material.
Okay.
Just can I add something? First of all, hi everyone. Sorry for delay. Actually, I'm in a business trip, so yeah, my name is Hassan Pishgar. Quickly introduce myself and working for Wageningen University Research. So regarding your question about the bedding material, there are some databases that provides some information about the environmental impact of bedding material, like for example, database that are available in software like Singapore equivalent database. But I can imagine that based on our experience, the contribution of bedding material in total GHG emission of sport horse is not that much. So we ignored at this step or neglected, if we add it, also it doesn't have that much contribution to total GHG emission, as I mentioned. Yeah.
So there's two questions in the Q&A. I'd say probably the first is a little bit more for Ulf and the EEF about what are the next steps for this project. Does the report contain recommendations, suggestions?
So as I started off with them, but this was first of all an awareness situation. So we wanted to have this kind of tooling. We wanted to understand what kind of impact different activities have from a carbon footprint point of view. And then of course we need to make the conclusions what the next steps would be. So what we will try to do is to exactly get to what the question was all about. That is, what are the recommendations then in the different ages of the horses, and what can you do to have a positive impact on a carbon footprint point of view. But we're not there yet with these kind of conclusions, but that would be the next step.
And then back for the researchers was about the sample of the data collection, and do you think the results would be different in other countries? So
to start with the first question, so we collected data from various different stables. The focus was on sport horses, so we actually visited a few top stables in the Netherlands and collected data there. So we actually had a whole questionnaire with all sort of different questions. And then the second question was if it applies to other countries. So I think it depends which countries you're talking about. So I think, so to sort of say, I think the situation in Europe is probably quite similar. So then it might not probably differ too much, but it really depends on a little bit on what is the sort of structure in the country. So are there breeding yards or not? Because then the horses obviously come from a different country. So yeah.
Well, and what we see in fact, the key in animal emissions is in fact the reproduction rate and the growth rate. you know, because in fact you can consider the reproduction rate as a kind of overhead that's needed to produce new horses. And with low fertility, in fact, you have, well, less production of new horses, which means that these emissions will play a bigger role. So it means that growth rate, fertility rate, and in fact, yeah, and the feed, of course, the type of feed with the emissions of the feed, that play an important role. And that can differ per country, yes.
Just in order to add points that Theun and Iris mentioned, you know, about the next step, always for this type of projects or activities, we say that the first step is getting knowing about what is the current situation. So first step is awareness, increasing the awareness about the sustainability aspects of, for example, a sector. Then we know that what is the current situation, and when we highlight the hotspots, the next step is reducing, finding some solution to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. So we are at the step that we are somehow monitoring the current situation. Regarding the how can I say that the differences in feed material, the differences in different stables in countries. Was that there was I can say that I can say that it's something like a point that can be considered for equine sector, is that we do not have a defined structure for the data collection. I can imagine this is the first step. So we also had in some countries, even for the livestock, that we do not have a specific defined structure for the data collection. So yeah, I think the next step for the equine sector would be that defining this structure for collecting data, then it's possible to compare better the differences, the situation in different countries, and have a better idea about the differences in different countries.
So another question is, are standards and sustainable building materials for barn, arena, etc. available for calculation in Hoofprint? No, the short answer is no, they're not. Usually, I think they're not taken into account in LCA calculations.
Well, and that in fact holds for also other livestock sectors. Yeah. When we look at the footprint of milk and meat, etc., building constructions are not taken into account.
What would we like to include in our next version besides bedding? Well, another thing that we found out, Hassan already touched upon the data collection, which turned out to be not very easy, is that, for example, what we also found difficult is because usually you take into account into an LCA your energy use and your water use, but that was actually really hard to get those numbers because what we found out, some stables have multiple functions, so they don't only train horses, but they also have, for example, accommodations for people to stay and come train with their horses. So it was really hard to actually figure out, okay, what is your actual water use for the horses and what's your actual energy use that goes into the horse facility. So not, so yeah, so that's definitely an improvement I think we'd like to make. Other improvements. Yeah, I'm kind of looking to Theun or Hassan. They have there's quite a lot I think that we could improve because obviously it's the first version.
Well, the problem is always that if you start thinking about improvements, you can think of many more things than you're able to incorporate. But this also depends on the discussion with you as potential users, because I can imagine that you have certain ideas about how to proceed, and that, well, can also define which extensions you need in the next version, if you want the next version.
Yes.
But I mean, just to comment that. So, sorry for interrupting you, Iris. No. This is all about awareness. I mean, you have started off with the most important parts. Then, of course, when we start to use the tool, we start to make the conclusions. Then we'll see what kind of areas that is needed, and could make an impact that should be added. But I mean, if we start with something, then at least we know where we're going, and then we can see what would the potential next steps be then. So I think this is a very good start.
Transport. So if we looked at different disciplines, yes, we did. We actually went to stables that have different disciplines, so show jumping, dressage, and eventing. We're also currently working on a scientific paper on this, and actually there we like to show a case study on the jump from the jumping horse and the dressage horse. And what we actually found out is that a show jumping horse travels a lot more than a dressage horse. So what you saw in the example, that was based on a jumping horse, and it was to see Amanda's, also to have touched upon Amanda's question, it was based on an annual European horse competition schedule. So I actually used the Global Championship Tour and all the countries that they go to calculate that. So yeah, let me see. Is it more important to focus on the main emission source, transport for a small quantity of farms, or focus on other emission sources for the greatest number of farms? I think that depends. So yeah, we did look at a top sport horse, and I think usually the majority of horses probably don't travel as much as a horse that is in top sport. I think it also maybe depends on country. Like we in the Netherlands are really small, so it's short distances. But I can imagine if it's, I don't know, the United States, then they travel longer distances. So that obviously has an impact. So I think it also depends on what is your activity with the horse. So yeah, for a training stable that is not as focused on a competition or let's say a riding school, then the horse obviously doesn't go on transport as much. So yeah, then it's logic to maybe focus on your feed emissions to reduce on the feed to reduce your emissions. But I think when you look at a top sport horse, the transport is so huge that that's probably one of the first I personally I think would look at. So hopefully that answers your question.
The point is that we can consider as a sensitivity low, medium, and high traveling schedule as a sensitivity analysis. And one of the advantage of the tool is that it provides this option that the user can play with different options and see at the same time what is the impact of, for example, increasing the intensity of traveling. What is the impact on the, for example, the carbon footprint of the sport horse?
And we also calculated transport without flights, and then you already see a lot like quite a decrease. So
there was just a related question in the chat, which I think Hassan has actually just answered, but it was just asking about what the model was for calculating the travel. I mean, is there just a standard calculation that you're able to accurately use, or how is that kind of factored into the calculation?
Yeah, for that part, we have different options regarding the transport vehicles. So the user can select the type of the transport, and also the other parameters, two other parameters that are playing an important role in the environmental impact of transport are mass of the mass and the distance. So the type of the vehicle, mass, and the distance are three items that can be adjusted in the tool in order to calculate the environmental impact of transport.
Another question on do you think that you will include carriage driving too? I think we could include that if that's a wish, but I think you can already, if you want to calculate your impact from carriage driving, I think you can already make an estimation with how Hoofprint is now. So, but then you first have to calculate it for one horse, and then you have to, at this point, you have to calculate per horse, but I think you can still do that, and then just calculate for multiple horses basically, and then add it up.
There's a lot of information on transport emissions using all different types of transport ways, cars, trucks, airplanes, ships, trains, and also related to the weight that is transported. So that's well documented, and it's relatively easy to extend.
Then a question about, is research is driven by the sector or developments in regulations? Do you foresee regulations being put in place for environmental in the equine sector? I don't really know on an EU scale, but if I look at the Netherlands, I think this project was definitely more driven by the sector. In the Netherlands, there's a lot of focus on the production animals at the moment, especially on, well, dairy cattle. So but I actually think it's good that it actually comes from the sector, because I reckon at some point there will probably be, like interest from the government as well. So I think it's really good that it's initiated by the sector first. I don't know if Ulf wants to add something to this question.
And I mean, of course, European Union, they will have thoughts about this, but to start with, this is all about awareness right now. So we started this to be aware of the situation, so we know what kind of footprint we actually have from a carbon footprint point of view, so we can have this kind of discussion if and when it starts. For the time being, we don't foresee that, but we do know that European Union have started to 2026, I think this, you need to declare the sustainability impact on products. There's no regulations, there are no levels set, but you need to start a process for evaluating when you produce a product. And then, of course, the question is, will that also be a request for this kind of activities? And for sure, we don't know, but we need to be prepared for it. And therefore, I think this is very, again, as I said, extremely good initiative to start off with. But today, there's no such discussion, to my awareness at least.
Right. Also speaking about a view from the entire message. Don't really quite get your question on for the entire. So you mean what is the greatest? If there's one action for the entire equine sector, what action do you need to take? Is that what you want to know, Agatha? Or,
yes, I think, looking at, I guess, what's the biggest take home as a sector that we would then need to action?
Right. I do still think that depends on what aspect of the sector you're looking at. So we only look at sport horse, and then I think obviously, like we already mentioned, transport it's got a huge impact. So I think that's something to think about. But then that's obviously a small part of this. Also, it's a small part of the sector. So there's a lot of other horses that also have an impact. But then if that's only focused on feed, manure, and enteric fermentation, then I think it's feed to first focus on. So I hope that gives a bit of an answer.
It depends on in fact the fraction of horses that are used in top sport at the global level, to a regional level and a local level, and horses that are just there for recreation and don't travel at all. And if you know those fractions, you can also see, okay, what sector or what subsector is in fact a hotspot in my total equine sector. And per subsector, you could also define different actions.
Mm-hmm.
But indeed, that's all part of the awareness process, which just has started.
I think it's extremely important what you say there. So this is the start of the awareness project, and then we need to make the conclusions and to be able to answer that question. So as the question were earlier on, should you focus on bedding, which impacts everyone, or should you focus on transport, which mainly impact the ones who travel globally? And that is the conclusions needs to be made right now to see what is then the best way forward to have a positive impact.
Yeah, correct. And in addition to that, Laura's question, is it possible for the national federations to have the calculation method?
Yeah.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
And again, then of course, if you can have a guideline, so if you have a horse that mainly has its activity locally, then the footprint is this big.
Yeah.
If you have someone traveling international, then it's this big. If it's only national, so you can get an easy way of doing it, because if you to put in each and every horse in this tool, then the federation won't do anything else than that. So we need to make the guidelines, we need to make conclusions, and we're not there yet. But this gives us the possibility to get there.
Yes.
Yes.
Indeed.
Yeah. And I think Hoofprint will become available for the national federations. I think we just still have to quite talk about with the EF when it will be available. But yeah. In feed, are supplements included? No, supplements were not included. We focused on the main diets. Yeah, whether they would have an overall. Yeah, I think if you look at supplements, my assumption would be that they have a small impact, because it's not that you feeding huge amount of it. Usually they only get like, yeah, not that much. So yeah.
Well, the matter is also that it's quite a challenge to find emission data of supplements, because supplements are based on minerals, some other additives, etc. It's also a company secret, and it means that you will not find a footprint of it. So it's very hard to incorporate that. That's the same as what we see in the use of all kind of feed additives in livestock industry, in pork and poultry and dairy. But indeed, you don't feed it in large fractions, so the impact is relatively small.
Yeah, and I guess because in Hoofprint you can select, there's a whole list of different feed ingredients. So you can also sort of, if you have, for example, a feed stuff that's not in there, like you want a certain type of concentrate, like we put in a concentrate that's based on an equine concentrate. But if you think, I want something different, then you can just select all the different ingredients yourself to sort of make up your own mix of feed.
Is forage included in the calculations, is asked here.
Forage, where is
yes.
Is that in the chat? Or
yeah.
I don't see the question. Yeah, it is included.
Yeah, all feed is included.
Yeah, and we also take pasture time into account, so whether the horse is on pasture or not.
Yes.
Right. We're running out of open questions. But you got a lot of questions, and that means there's a bigger interest of this tool, and of course the result out of the tool. So we have worked together with the university, and the university have, of course, developed this tool. We're looking into what the next steps would be, either from an expansion point of view, from a tooling, or how we should use the tool. Either, as I said earlier on, to have the conclusions, guidelines to help you what can be done to actually make an impact. That's the first. We have discussed back and forth how to have access to the tools. We will set up on a central site by EEF. But then we also look into what kind of support is needed, how will it help them to draw the conclusions and so on. And I must admit, we're not really through that yet. So we need to look into it. I guess that, Theodore, if we can set it up centrally, we can have some few accesses to gain more insight and information. But to use this on a broader scale, we need to look into this a little bit further as well.